All right, I'm here. It's part 2. Can you get off my back now? 2 months ago, I made a vid. 2 months ago? Okay, maybe you guys had a point. Anyways, that video documented my time marathoning video game development by making a new game every single week. If you missed out on it, I'd recommend you check it out first. You don't have to, you can check it out here if you want, but as a recap, new game with a new theme every week, working in small groups, the groups change every single week, and part 1 is about 40 minutes of me slowly losing my mind. But because I wanted to be true to my full experience making those games, that video went a little bit long and it only covered like 3 of the games, so we're here talking about the last 3, and then I'm also going to talk a little bit about what I learned during this process. It's like show and tell, but only I'm important. If you remember, at the end of the last video, I said this. I was hoping that for week 4, I could do something a little bit more simple and take it a little bit easy for the week, because week 3 had been an emotionally draining experience. And if you thought for even a second I was actually going to follow through on that, then you are quite possibly a dumb person. To be fair to me, I feel like this week was always going to be a little bit more intense because the prompt for this week was the most daunting of the bunch. Procedural generation, aka, to keep it simple, a significant level of randomization, usually in the levels themselves. Most often this is found in roguelikes. You play through a sequence of levels, you die, you restart back at the beginning, you play again, and the levels you're seeing have changed. They're in a different order, they've been entirely replaced, the things inside of them have changed, the loot has changed, etc. This isn't the only way that you'll see procedural generation be used, but it's the main one. It usually takes a lot of fine-tuning to balance levels given the randomization, and there's also different ways to accomplish procedural generation, like binary space partitioning, which is basically like creating a binary tree and then occupying each node with a level, and then more stochastic methods where you set up an agent that sort of roams around, randomly selecting its path, where it's placing corridors, where it's placing rooms, etc. until you have a full map. No matter what you do though, it is a bit of a learning curve to even wrap your head around this stuff, much less learn how to implement it well and create a fun experience in 7 days, but thankfully there are a lot of plugins that handle the brunt of the work. You just gotta know how to use them in your game. Now, just like weeks 1 to 3, I immediately started brainstorming some ideas and then called a group meeting the next day to discuss some of them. Personally, I wanted to avoid top-down dungeon generation because I felt like that was a bit too generic, so my idea was to create an endless version of Ollie Ollie, something that I'm certain already exists in some capacity, but I thought it would be a fun way to experiment with procedural generation. Just like in the Ollie Ollie games, you would have all these different obstacles that you had to leap over or rail grind on while doing tricks and timing your actions for bonus points, but in our game, we'd break everything down into a list of discrete blocks, and then each one would be randomly placed at the end of the last one, creating one big endless level. Nobody liked my idea. I guess the slew of endless runners have sort of marred the idea of making one to a lot of people, which, fair enough. But another concept from one of my group mates was a spark of a pretty long brainstorming session. A brainstorming session that I actually want to discuss here at length in this section because I think it's a pretty good indication of the good and bad of making bulletproof design as a new designer on a time crunch. I've been trying to highlight different parts of the creative process in each of these weeks, not just the final idea and how it was pieced together, so hopefully you enjoy this longer look at the concepting phase. Let's start with the original idea, which involved a cat trying to find her way through this big maze. The cat had a limited number of kittens with her and was placed in a randomly generated matrix of rooms. Behind the scenes, the game would identify the shortest path to the exit, which would have exactly as many rooms as you had kittens. If you were just walking freely around the maze, leaving any particular room would teleport you to a random other room. But if you left a kitten in a room, it would freeze it in place and allow you to maneuver right back to the old room. Basically, if you weren't dropping kittens and went up in this room, you might be spit out into this one, and if you tried to retrace your steps, you'd be put into yet another random room. It was unpredictable. If you put a kitten here though, going up would take you to the actual room right above, and you could go back down to your original room just fine. Your goal was basically to just chain a bunch of kittens together that let you navigate to the exit, and for a sense of danger, small basic enemies were able to spawn in and steal your kittens, with you needing to backtrack over to them in order to save them in time. The concept sounds pretty interesting. Until you start trying to break it. Here's a question. If going through random doorways leads you to random rooms, why don't you just keep going to random rooms until you find the exit? Okay, well, I guess we could make it that the exit is the only room that you can't directly teleport to, but then couldn't you just teleport to a random room, drop a kitten, take a peek into the next room? If it's not the exit, you just pick it up and try it all again? Alright, maybe you can only drop kittens in rooms that are beside a room that already has a kitten in it. But even if you fix that, you have a very tedious loop of purely guessing where to go, fumbling around. If you run out of kittens, you remove the last one and then head into another route. If that's still not it, you move back 2 kittens in the chain and then keep trying different turns at these hinges. It's just busy work. Maybe you give an indication for whether something is on the golden path or not, which eliminates some of the backtracking, but it also takes away any agency from the player. It's still just guessing randomly and trying another guess if that one didn't work. It's just a lot shorter now, and you're not even solving anything. You're just being told if every move is right or not. And that's just a handful of problems that we found in the original idea. There were still plenty more, so we clearly needed to make some decent changes, if not a massive overhaul. In trying to fix these problems, one of my favorite ideas that we ended up leaving behind was called Dijkstra Fireman, named after Dijkstra's algorithm, which measures the shortest distance between 2 nodes on a graph. In it, you had a fire hose and a fire to put out, but the hose length was capped to only be long enough to make it if you took the shortest path. As entertaining as the concept was, though, it was still difficult to find out how to circumvent the reliance on guesswork. How would you give enough options or visual cues to the player to make the correct choices without making it so obvious that the game had no inherent puzzle solving? Because that's effectively what we were trying to make, a puzzle game. We thought of maybe giving the player the ability to make makeshift shortcuts at the cost of time, since you had a time limit to complete your job, and a few other solutions, but nothing got us an idea that felt truly polished. Which is where I have to ask the question, should it have been polished? I mentioned earlier that there are positives and negatives to creating bulletproof design. On one hand, we were able to avoid a foundationally broken concept by putting a little bit of pressure on it early on. How would players behave? Where are the holes? What's a minor tweak? And what's something game-breaking that is built into the idea itself? On the other hand, there's always certain things that are better played by ear. You can't always figure them out at ground zero. We had a chance to work on something that I find more conceptually interesting than what our final game actually ended up being this week, but we dropped it because I was too critical of that fun factor, even though this was supposed to be an exercise in using procedural generation in unique ways. As a creative, you often have to ask yourself, how do I know when an idea holds enough water to continue? How much do I need to iron out before I write down the first line of code or the first sentence in my script? And these are personal parameters that you need to decide for yourself. It's really up to you and your team. I can't tell you what to do, but it isn't a problem that you should take lightly. I typically spend a decent amount of time at the beginning of any project, whether it's a game or a video or a paper, whatever, just trying to destroy my own ideas, putting up any counter argument I can, and then seeing if my ideas can withstand them. But I also found a long time ago that doing that for too long can sometimes just start leading you in circles. You end up putting a counter argument to every argument you're making, and then you read that sentence out, and then you have to argue against that sentence, and you put it all in so that you tell people, hey, I did think of this stuff, my argument is airtight, but my presentation is not. Sometimes you don't even see the solution to these arguments until it's right in front of you, which means that it's not always great to squash these impossible questions at the very beginning. But it's also a very dangerous game to look something in the eye that you know is a problem from the very beginning and say, I'll get to that later. More often than not, those are words you're gonna regret. It's a very difficult, constant question you need to ask yourself in any creative field, and at the end of the day, you just have to trust your gut and keep learning lessons for next time. There's a reason nobody's good at this stuff right away. As we continued to hone in on the final idea, we started leaning a little bit more towards the timed aspect of the game and a little bit farther away from the harsh constraint that you had to find the shortest path possible, with one idea from a groupmate being that you played as a terrorist who needed to plant a bomb in time. There were no kittens or fire hoses that constrained your movement, but you did have a time limit to find the plant point and then leave before the bomb went off. An idea that I had to unfortunately veto for obvious reasons. But hate crime aside, this actually did lead into our final idea because we realized that a great way to fix a lot of our problems was to actually show the path to the player beforehand and then force them to use their memory to retrace those steps. That way we could use landmarks or specific room shapes which weren't explicitly hints, they weren't lit different or had big glowing arrows telling you it was the correct path, but if you were paying attention, they meant something to you. So here was our final idea. You are an Indiana Jones type explorer looking for an artifact. You start at the entrance of a tomb, which is also the only exit. Before you reach the artifact, you are free to explore your own pace. You might see special markings on the walls, skeletons lying around, weirdly shaped rooms, and all kinds of visual indicators, and you use that information to track down how to get back to the beginning. Once you picked up the artifact, every light besides your torch would shut off, and you would be given a limited time to escape the way you came with the artifact in hand. And that should have been it. That was more than we needed. We had procedural generation involved, we had a bit of a brain twister with you needing to memorize the path to escape, we had tension with the timer. I mean, we were good. This is all we needed. And then I tried to make it more bulletproof. Argument, counter-argument, response, counter-response. I can safely say that for the scope of this project, I severely over-designed it. Here's a little rundown of basically my entire internal design process from here on out. The exploration game loop seems a bit too boring and one-dimensional. Let's give the player something else to do. How about we add loot so the player is encouraged to explore and open chests? What would the loot do though? Why would anyone want to collect it? I guess it would be kind of cool if it gave you like special abilities during the escape section. You'd be more likely to succeed with better gear. Okay, so now the player has more of an excuse to explore, but they're still just walking into rooms, trying to understand the ideal escape path, and then sometimes opening chests. Maybe they'll find the right path early and then just visit all the other rooms anyways to gear up. But it sounds like that's not more fun, it's just more tedious. Okay, what if there's a chance to encounter challenge rooms, like ones where enemies appear or you need to complete a small puzzle? That can shake up the monotony. Well, what's the point of going into these places? If you fail, do you lose health or something? Because that's a whole other system, and you need to see if that actually complements the rest of the game. Alright, fair enough. What if there isn't a health system, but these challenge rooms are tied to rewards? Take no damage or get all the puzzle answers correct, get a great prize. Take 1 damage or mess up the last puzzle, get an okay prize. Do worse than that, get nothing. Okay, sure. So then exploring is just collecting a ton of positive abilities that'll trivialize the escape, while not exploring means you'll probably get your shit rocked in the second half of the gameplay loop? Yeah, basically. But that's still not fun for the player. The best roguelike dungeon crawlers have you consider whether it's worth exploring more levels at the expense of the damage it might inflict on you. Sometimes engaging is the right idea, sometimes preserving what you have is better. Sure, but that usually takes a much more fleshed out combat system, which I don't really want to do because it's more work, but also it distracts from our central idea too much. Maybe I should incorporate negative abilities, like not all your exploration will reap good rewards. But what incentive would anyone ever have to use negative abilities? That just seems silly. Plus, you always have to make sure the odds are still in favor of the player to get something good more than they get something bad, but a subtle difference in the rarity of loot probably won't indicate to the player that they have a slight advantage every time they open a chest. Fine, what if the ability system looked like this? Each ability you collect is put in a toolbar, with the most recent one you picked up appearing on the left. When you make your escape, you can only use the leftmost ability, and it gets discarded after use. That means if you last picked up a negative ability, but there's a positive one right after that you really want to use, you have to take the bad with the good. If you're exploring and rack up a decent set of good abilities, you might stop pushing your luck and start the escape, otherwise you could get hit with some bad luck. But if the last couple you picked up were negative, you might be more inclined to keep looking in hopes of getting a better starting set of tools. To help you out even more, exploring could also net you a special burn ability, which allows you to discard any ability without using it. I feel like this would be a really good balance of player control while still being partially at the mercy of RNG. Now that long-ass conversation seems great in theory. I've clearly thought things out, I've come up with ideas that are more complex and enjoyable and interesting, and you might be thinking this sounds like a much better game now, and it does. But this is probably a nice time to remind you that we had a week to do this. This was an obscene amount of work. I added a weighted looting system, enemies, combat challenges, a ton of different abilities, an AI that had to do pathfinding in procedurally generated environments, and an inventory management system, all because I thought our short experimental introduction to PCG was a little too boring, maybe. I didn't have to do it all myself, thank God. I think that would have been legitimately impossible. A groupmate of mine did a lot of the PCG stuff, and another one did a lot of the enemy AI. But even with that all gone, I still had a mountain of work to get through. This is 100% my kryptonite. It's the thing that I'm worst at, and I realized it throughout this entire process. It's looking at an idea in the face, an idea that's good in a vacuum, and saying no. Whether due to time constraints or the amount of explanation it would require or pacing, this good thing should be removed from the project. And to prove that I actually am learning, I'm gonna do that right now. I had a whole planned section here that showed my struggles implementing all this stuff. I even had footage from when I was actively working on the game in October. I had this all figured out. Most of the script was written in the last week. This stuff was written months ago, and I'm no longer gonna do it. It's too long. It makes almost a whole video about this one game, and ultimately it just shows that I was tired and I screwed myself with how much work I assigned, and I can just tell you that. I was tired and I screwed myself. By some miracle I got it done, but I hated my life. You'll be seeing some of the in-progress and final footage in the background. The game wound up very feature complete by the end, but you don't need to see the grind it took to get there. The one thing I will go in detail about making this game is the plugin, because it was very different and it's pretty interesting. Basically, the plugin allowed us to create a tree of different room types, all with different probabilities of appearing. And then based on that tree, the plugin would create these nodes, put in the rooms we defined, and then connect them with corridors that we also defined. Room types included empty rooms, landmark rooms, which had like some sort of interesting symbol or characteristic to them, enemy rooms, password rooms, and chest rooms. And for each of these, we had variations with different shapes or decorations. Each one was made manually. We had to go in, paint a tile map, and place stuff like torches wherever we saw fit, rinse and repeat. We separated them by type, put that type in a folder, and then set those types in the plugin so it would would pick a room from the designated folder at random. We also set up points in each room where a corridor could be potentially connected, so the map layouts had more flexibility. My personal favorite room was the password room. I set up a set of torches on the wall and then gave the player different patterns to remember. The player had to recreate them, and depending on how much they did right, they'd get a reward. By this point, it was also glaringly obvious that we needed a comprehensive tutorial because this was all way too much information, so I took what I learned from last week and applied it to the tutorial here. No single part of making this game was necessarily that difficult, at least not the work I had to do, but it was way too much. And as much as I joked about the first 3 weeks draining my soul, this week was really the 500-pound weight that broke the camel's back. I was exhausted. At one point I was working until like 6:30 a.m. I couldn't keep this up. The presentation went well. Everyone was kind of horrified at how much time we put into this, and for the first time I felt like I had given entirely too much work to my group mates, not just myself, which was a real wake-up call that I actually had to stop telling myself that I was going to give myself lower workload for the rest of the weeks and actually do it. I wasn't just ruining my own schedule anymore, I was ruining other people's. So for week 4's game, I'm going to give myself an 8 out of 10. There were definitely some janky elements, but the sheer scope of it was impressive, I think. And for week 4's quality of life when developing, I'm giving it a crisp 2 out of 10. Let's move on to, thankfully, a much more relaxing week 5. Week 5, we had one goal: make your game feel good. And me personally, I had my own one goal: make an incredibly simple game feel good. So I didn't overthink it. I went straight to YouTube, searched up some game dev tutorials, found the easiest, most basic baby's first game ass videos, went to my group mates and said, all right, we're doing this. Top-down shooters are pretty simple to make at their core, and I had no interest in going past the core. Our top-down shooter would only feature simple shapes. Our top-down shooter would take place on top of a blank background. Our top-down shooter would have one weapon type. Our top-down shooter would have one enemy type. The enemies in our top-down shooter would not shoot you, they would just run into you, deal damage, and then get destroyed. This was the whole game. It took me less than 30 minutes to set this all up. Now I am kind of lying, that is my specialty after all. This isn't all the game was gonna be, because one big thing that I wanted to have was a few abilities that were on cooldowns that would let you deal damage in a large radius or some kind of status effect or something, but I also told myself that no matter how many ideas I had, I would only pick 3 abilities. All my other time would just be spent making things feel better. The first ability that I wanted to add was a freeze attack, which when triggered would stop every enemy on screen in their tracks. They still had to be shot to be killed, but they were sitting ducks. All that took was like a single line of code on the enemies that said, if this button is pressed, stop moving. It didn't affect any enemies that spawned in after the ability was used, just the ones currently on screen. Now initially, I was just gonna add the next 2 abilities right after, but it was important to me that all the abilities were thematically consistent and worked well together visually and conceptually. And I felt like I couldn't really do that without seeing the freeze ability fully fleshed out with all the game feel elements, so I shifted to making some fun effects in the game instead. It started out pretty simple: screen shake when you destroyed enemies, some little sound effects when you shot your weapon, and a little explosion effect for extra oomph. I noticed that taking damage from enemies wasn't really communicated with the player effectively. You could see your health go down, but there was no real feeling of getting hit, and I could definitely see a scenario where when the game picked up, you'd take damage without realizing. So I looked online for a chromatic aberration effect, sort of like what they do in the Spider-Verse movies. I wound up finding a more generic glitch effect intended for UI elements that I repurposed to impact the whole screen and only play for a split second after taking damage. But because I still wanted to do some color shifting, I decided to also change the color of the player, enemies, and background whenever you got hit. There are 2 color schemes that you swap between, and I think overall it gives the impression that you're fighting in some kind of interdimensional space, even though there's no detailed background or fancy spacecraft sprite work. It was just colors changing, but it has a cool effect, I don't know. I also thought adding a slightly less aggressive screen shake for every shot from your weapon instead of just a bigger shape when you killed enemies made the gameplay feel a little bit more chaotic and impactful, even when you weren't hitting anything, and it was a style that I enjoyed, so I kept it. A lot of small tweaks I made to the game this week came about the same way. I would play through the game, I would notice what felt a little bit off, I'd brainstorm, research, experiment, see what felt good, and then little by little I was enjoying doing the things that I was already doing a little bit more every time. When it came to the freeze ability, I really wanted to emphasize that this was an elemental freeze. It wasn't like a time stop, it was a freeze. So I turned all the frozen enemies blue, I added screen shake here as well for a little impact, I added a blue vignette which slowly faded out, and added a sound effect of ice forming. And last up, I made sure that when an enemy was hit, the explosion would be bigger, it would also be blue, and instead of the typical sound of an enemy getting destroyed, it'd sound like ice shattering. It was super cool seeing how much these simple choices affected how fun this ability was to use, and I actually really enjoyed playing around with it, even though without all the effects, it feels like the game just glitches or breaks down. It reminded me a lot of how much the lighting transformed my game from week 3. Now that I'd leaned so hard on the elemental side of the freeze effect, I really wanted to keep that going, maybe do an earthquake or a Pokemon grass attack, you know? Eventually I landed on a wind ability that pushed enemies back, and a fire ability that instantly killed all enemies on screen. A little basic, but that was the goal, remember? Basic, but feels good. The 3 abilities were obviously different levels of effective. I mean, one bought you a couple of seconds, another eliminated immediate danger, and then the last one just eliminated everything. So they had accordingly balanced cooldowns to make up for it. The other 2 abilities got similar vignettes of different colors, their own unique sound effects, and their own particle effects. And I should mention here that aside from a handful of effects like this wind thing and the vignettes, I got most of these things either from online or from online tutorials. A lot of this stuff doesn't really classify as OC, at least on its own, which brings into question, how impressive is all of this if it's just found online? And the answer is, I don't know, it's up to you to figure out how you feel about it, but I will say one thing that I mentioned back in week 2 was just as important as actually creating this stuff is curating it. You can view it as sort of different roles in the same ecosystem. In a more professional setting, these visual effects would obviously be made by somebody in-house because of copyright. I think the rules are a little bit looser for a little prototype project like this, but regardless, the person who decides what to use, what to make, and how it all fits together is often separate from the creation process. It depends on how the company works, of course, but these are all different skills, and it's nice that some weeks I felt like my work was mainly programming, while other weeks it was design, or even UX and storytelling. Anyways, once the abilities came together, the game was basically done. I sped up the spawn rates of enemies over time, added some basic UI stuff, and that was it. I finished with plenty of time to spare. There were moments where I wanted to go back and add new mechanics or abilities, but I treated this week as a bit of a lesson in discipline. If it wasn't an idea that was going to subtly improve the things that were already there, I wanted no part in it, because I knew that if it was a bigger idea and it went wrong, I would have a hard time parting with it, and then I would just end up knee-deep in another marathon right before the thing was due. Overall, I think this week was a really good showcase of how going from 0 game feel to featuring just a couple of particle effects, sound effects, and color changes took the game from feeling broken to feeling honestly kind of fun to muck around with. And you can see that gradual change even better when certain elements are toggled on and off. Looking back on it, I definitely went a little nutty with the screen shake. I definitely could have toned that down for sure, and the fire effect looks too detailed in comparison to the rest of the game, which leans more cartoony, but I think I still did a good job of doing what I set out to do. I don't think I can rate it as a game because the game is just there as a foundation for everything else, but for what the week was meant to do, I give it an 8 out of 10. Alright. The scary word has entered the building. No, you didn't read that wrong. The prompt for week 6, the last week, was to use generative AI in your game. This might need a bit of explanation. I know the second generative AI is brought up, there is a very visceral reaction from both extremes, but especially in games, this is like a slur. And keep in mind, slurs aren't slurs to gamers, so this is serious. Gen AI gets a lot of shit for a lot of reasons, some of the biggest being that it threatens a lot of jobs, there are serious privacy and harassment concerns, and it wipes its ass with copyright. And I think it's more than understandable for an artist to get mad about the fact that we're already seeing big companies use AI art, because not only does that mean that these companies might be fine with letting go of most of their art department and just use Midjourney instead, but that piece of art might have directly used some of that artist's work without any trace of credit to create the images that are getting them fired. That is more than a good reason to hate this thing and hate it on behalf of other people as well. At the same time, I do think it's worth acknowledging that it does improve a lot of things. I mean, recent example, I've seen my younger sister spend hours, sometimes days, on creating flashcards from her notes on Quizlet so she can study, and I just heard that you can apparently just copy and paste it into there now, and an AI will just make flashcards for you. That's just a really helpful tool to have. I told her about it a few days ago, and I have never seen her happier in my life because of Quizlet. The girl has no life. Generally speaking, the pattern that I've noticed is that the more creatively inclined the field is, the more sour people are on AI, which makes sense. A lot of people at least want regulations in place for this stuff, particularly when it comes to how it infringes on copyright or privacy, but you could also argue that a lot of commonplace AI is literally nothing without infringing on those things, so the whole thing's gotta go. I have seen people work on projects that would be really helpful to developers on the design level. I've even seen some devs actively trying to incorporate them in their workflow, not so that their final assets are AI, but just so they can mock up levels, almost like a pre-visualization before they set something in stone. Again, just a helpful tool. But all of this stuff is true too, and even though everyone in my field is pretty gung-ho about AI, I'm never gonna discredit that stuff, and I do think it's a discussion that needs to be had. So when I found out the prompt for week 6 was the incredibly vague, use generative AI to make your game, it could affect it a little or a lot, it could be at the concept level, design time, or runtime, just do something with Gen AI, I couldn't not wonder about this discussion. So I did something kind of weird. A couple of minutes ago when talking about week 5, I described myself as a curator. I said that the things I was putting together weren't mine, I was just making the decisions on when and how to use them. I took a good hard look at what exactly I was doing. What was my role? What was my worth? Is this something anyone could do? Does it take a certain skill set? Is it something that you can automate, etc.? And I realized what I was gonna do for my last prototype. I was gonna make the exact same game I just made, but I was gonna make an AI do it. I was gonna make me tell it how to do everything. I'm a coconut brain now, I don't know anything. How do I put this object on screen? How do I put code on that object? When I make this effect, how long should it last? How should it look? How do I make the character look in the direction of my mouse? All the functional stuff, but then also all the creative stuff. What ability should I put in my game? How do I make them feel better? I was basically just gonna be dragging things where it told me to drag it and copy and pasting things where it told me to copy and paste it. I was ChatGPT's hands, but ChatGPT was the game designer. I wanted to see if it would crash and burn. So this is probably the part where you expect me to explain how that went, but unfortunately, you're gonna hate me for this, but that's gonna be its own video. Yeah, I know, I made you wait like 2 months for part 2 and I'm not even talking about every game on there, but this project just took on a life of its own, which is a terrifying sentence when talking about AI. There's just too much to talk about here, and I feel like I need a full dedicated video to do it justice. What started out as me just trying to make a small case for why we need human designers and engaging in a critique of AI while seeing if it had any merit in a design role turned into something a lot bigger than I ever expected it to become, with a whole user study that some of you actually took part in. I'm sure some of you remember week 5's game because you played it. There are like full-on follow-up projects to this one that I'm working on now, and I just want to give this topic the proper time of day, so that'll be a video at some point in the future, although this one you can expect to be a lot later. Based on a few things that are out of my control, that one probably won't be out till like June. Last thing I want to clarify, again, like I said, this is a very hot button issue, and I'm sure some people are like rubbed the wrong way that I'm even doing an experiment in this realm, that I'm even entertaining this idea, but again, I want to reiterate that this was all meant as a critique of AI, and the reason I'm being very vague about it is because I don't want to give away that video, but eventually you'll find out what that entire project ended up being, what the conclusions were, what I'm still looking into, etc., and I just hope that you're excited to hear about it, because I do think it's kind of cool. Alright, I'm recording this last part on a different day without any video because my voice gave out, but I promise I'd do a little wrap up after I got through all the games, just give some thoughts on what I learned, what I'd do different, and most importantly, was it all worth it? I'll list the pros first. It was nice having a clear goal, an actual finish line to get to, and then you just didn't touch it after, so you needed to end the week satisfied with what you'd done. You can't just say you'll get to it later. It was also good for building up calluses, just like getting reps in. I felt infinitely better at the game making process by the end. Went from kinda knowing my way around Unity to feeling comfortable in that environment. I think if you're gonna do this, definitely have different prompts or areas of focus every single week, not just 6 random games that you thought up. Give yourself a challenge, set constraints, see how you would do if you weren't given complete freedom. These weeks also really taught me to trust my intuition. A lot of decisions just couldn't be mulled over for a copious amount of time, so you had to trust your gut a little. It's also super nice when you're thinking up a new game mechanic and remembering, oh, I sort of did something like this before, and you can go back and repurpose your old code. Lastly, I think the improvement is pretty exponential. Like, it's crazy to me looking at week 1 versus week 4, for example. Obviously different circumstances, but I had the same time for both, and it's ridiculous how much we crammed into 4. Even 5 was way better, and I sort of sleepwalked into that one. Doing just just like a 1 week sprint probably wouldn't have done much on its own, so making a few of these in a row was really helpful. Now the cons, and there are a lot of those too. First, it is goddamn stressful. I would assume most people that think of doing this don't have the luxury of just doing this. You might have work or school or any number of other obligations, and you really need to consider if that extra stress is worth it. I was doing this along with a couple other classes and it was already a nightmare, so I couldn't imagine doing it with like a 9 to 5. If you're really looking to launch your career in this, if you're trying to create portfolio pieces or build up the skills to make your dream game, I do think this is a good option to just jump into ice water right away, but it'll take a toll on you if you're really putting your all into it. It can also build some bad practices. As nice as it is to trust your intuition, you can lose a lot of organization in your code and come up with overcomplicated solutions that'll continuously affect the rest of the project. There are so many things I did over these weeks that would be a nightmare to work around if the project were to continue. Of course, the easiest way to avoid that would be to rein in your scope, but that's really tough to do when you're as inexperienced as I was when starting out, or even now. Like, I'm not like a changed man or anything. And the last thing is that as nice as it is completing all these projects in such a short amount of time, there were plenty of moments where I felt very discouraged, and if you're not careful, something like this can drive you away from your passions instead of setting you on your way. Days 5 and 6 of basically every week were so tough. I just sat there looking at what I had and got this creeping suspicion that this wasn't going to come together, and everyone would look at the final product and think, alright, that was garbage, you must have just thrown this together at the last minute, even though I've been working so hard on it. There were some last minute saves here, and I mean last minute. In week 4, we fixed a major lighting issue that made the game look broken during class about 3 minutes before we went up to present. I got very lucky that everything I presented was in as good of a state as it was. It really makes you sympathize with industry devs who put out a game and then everyone calls them lazy. I mean, I'll still criticize games, I can only react and review what's in front of me at the time, and if it's not good, it's not good. I might even talk about all the ways it could be better, but I also assume that they knew a lot of those things, they just couldn't get it done for one reason or another. No one's out there trying to make bad games. I always kind of knew that, but it's different when you see just how broken something can feel right before it gets really good, and you start to see just how fine of a line it can be. All in all, I'd say something like this is worth doing, but only if you understand how big of an undertaking it actually is, and you go into it hopefully more prepared than I was. I wouldn't recommend my exact experience to anybody, but I would recommend this challenge overall. It's just good motivation. Thanks for sticking around, especially until the end. This was really fun to put together. If you're new here, subscribe, join the Discord, it's in the description, and I'll see you all next time. Peace.